everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Purpose and Profit Sisterhood. I am Jeanette Anderson, your hostess with the mostest, and today I have all the way from across the pond the brilliant and fabulous Sam. Sam, tell them how to say your last name because I forgot to ask you.
How you say my last name is Mbatha. There's a lot of
Mbatha.
letters in there that don't make any sense, and it's a
Exactly.
kind of weird kind of way to say it, but Mbatha,
Mbatha. Okay. And what nationality? Where's your family? Who's your family?
South Africa.
Okay. I spent some time in South Africa. It's a beautiful country. Lots of challenges, but beautiful country. It's a beautiful area.
Yeah.
Did you grow up in Johannesburg or Cape Town,
No, grew up in London, born and
London?
raised. Yeah, been here my whole life, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Hence the accent and so forth. All right. So welcome. And it's 8 o'clock there tonight. Well, it's only 3 o'clock here, everybody. So he's staying up late just for you. So thank you, Sam. I'm going to tell you the official scoop on Sam. It's very brief, but I'll give you that. And then we're going to launch into a good segment on the art of storytelling, how to create and use story to grow your brand and your business. And if you've been watching any of the trends or if you've been noticing what's been talked about a lot, story has been used a lot, not only popularized by, story brand by the guy who wrote the book, whose name I can't remember right now, but lots and lots of discussion around it. So it is part and parcel of how we connect as human beings and have for centuries is through the power of story. So we're going to be talking about that today. So make sure that you've got pen and paper in hand so you can write down some notes about how to use your story. So let me tell you a little bit about Sam. Sam Mbatha is the founder of Stringcast Media, an audio-first media company working with clients such as Vogue, Victoria's Secret, and Vivida. You really like the V's. He creates immersive and engaging content based around storytelling, which is brilliant. And so tell me first what audio first media company means.
Well, it's just a fancy way of saying we make and create podcasts, but it's also a way for me to kind of differentiate myself from other media brands. So just kind of say, hey, we're focused on audio. If you're looking to get the best audio, you know you're in the right place.
Awesome. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then tell us a little bit about how you came to that work in the first place, but then we want to find out the juicy behind the scenes stuff. So just tell me a little bit about your journey and how you came to create Stringcast Media.
So the journey kind of starts, I guess, from me working in music and not enjoying working in music and thinking to myself, this is the dream. Everybody wants to do music. Why am I not enjoying it? Or what part of it do I enjoy? And I got speaking to someone. They were like, have you heard of podcasts? I'm like, of course I've heard of podcasting. What are you talking about? And she said to me, have you heard of companies like Gimlet and NPR and all that kind of stuff? They make podcasts. I'm like, okay, what does that mean to me? It's like, you could make podcasts for a living. And I said, oh, I don't know. I'll have a think about it. Then I thought about what I enjoyed making
Mhm.
music. I enjoyed editing the music down. I enjoyed recording the vocalists. I enjoyed directing the vocalists. And I said to myself, okay, I'll think about getting into podcasting. And I actually made it my plan before the pandemic happened that in March
Okay.
2020, I was going to start this podcast company, was going to launch my own podcast and then make podcasts for other people. It was going to be cut and shut really easy. Obviously, everyone who was there, everyone who's listening was there as well. March 2020 did not go as planned, but I still carried on with my plan, which was launching this company.
Mhm.
So I made a podcast called Scarce, which was a sci-fi audio drama,
Mm.
and it did really well. It ended up getting, to the top of the charts, top 10 all around the world, and a lot of people started noticing that and going, what is this Stringcast Media? Why have I never heard of it? Oh, this is their first show. Who are they backed by? This, that, and the third. And as people started reaching out to me on LinkedIn, they were like, oh, it's just you. I'm like, yeah, it's just me. You made all of this. I'm like, well, yeah, obviously, apart from all the voices, I hired people for that. But yeah, I wrote it, produced it, sound designed it, edited it, all that kind of stuff. And so from there was this kind of like weird fascination behind the scenes of like, who is this guy? Why has he got all these skills? And da 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 da. Got talking to a few people and yeah, ended up landing a few contracts and clients off the back of it. And yeah, it was really because of that first show, Scarce, which is, like I said, a sci-fi audio drama where I
Mhm.
got my first bits of client work and also got really kind of honed in on this idea of storytelling being the thing that I'm focused on in podcasting.
Brilliant. And you're saying scarce, SCARCE, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay,
Yes.
and what gave you the idea for that? Because that sounds like a very like that's not a typical podcast.
Yeah, it all came to me in dreams, which sounds a bit kind of J.K. Rowling-esque, but I kept having dreams about this world where it was controlled by computers and this algorithm thing and all this kind of stuff. And so I started writing it down in my Apple Notes. I was like, right, okay, there's this, there's that, and this and that. And obviously I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of a story. If I put a main character into this and put some people in places, good side, bad side, whichever way you want to view it, this could be enjoyable. And I was like, oh, it's a TV show. I'm like, do you know what? I haven't got the budget for a TV show. Let's try see if I can do this in a podcasty way. And yeah, that was it really. It just came to me through dreams and a bit of kind of refining those dreams into a story.
Interesting. And there are worse things than being J.K. Rowling-esque as far as an origin story. So that's really fascinating, and we want to talk a little bit more about that side of things as well. But tell us something about you that we wouldn't guess from reading your bio or looking at your website or whatever. What's something that people would never know if they didn't know you really, really, really well?
I know how to knit.
Ah, okay. Is that a hobby of yours?
No, it was something that I saw someone doing once when I was younger, and I was like to my mum, I was like, "How do I do this?" And she was like, "Oh, you need, needles and thread and all that kind of stuff." I was like, "Cool, teach me." And she thought I was joking, but yeah, I learned how to knit. I sat down and I knitted a scarf. Then I started tasking myself with a blanket, and I realized that knitting a blanket was a very big task. So I ended up putting that one to the side. But so far my knitting achievements are I've made a scarf. It's somewhere. I don't know where it is. I don't. I haven't seen it in over 20 years. But yeah, I know how to knit. I'm sure if someone put a needle and thread in front of me, as long as they cast it on and got it started, I'll get going and get knitting.
Awesome. All right. Well, and on those Christmases when you can't think of what to make for people or get for people, a homemade scarf is something they just cannot get away from or can re-gift. So it's perfect. So tell us a little bit about your why. Why does this work matter to you so much?
It matters to me because I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, which is crazy thinking that I spend all day working with and organizing and producing podcasts. But it's a form of entertainment that is unlike any other. Television, you have to kind of scroll through Netflix and the algorithm decides what to send to you. And music wise, you kind of already know what you like. You have this visceral reaction when you listen to music. But podcasting is this kind of strange thing where you have to be told by someone else to listen to a podcast. There's this very human connection to the voice. And you're listening to this person or people speak for sometimes an hour, over an hour. And for me, I really enjoy doing this work just because it's people sharing their stories, especially if they're working with me, they're sharing their stories, or they're sharing information that otherwise wouldn't really have another way to be shared. Like even just before this, I was listening to a podcast about retail buying or the buying of retail spaces. So how do people decide to buy a slot in a mall? And it's from a show called Odd Lots. And realistically, that wouldn't work on YouTube. It wouldn't be too interesting as a TV show, but as a podcast, you can have this kind of passive listening experience where you're hearing some people chat and you're learning a thing or you're enjoying yourself, and that just brings me joy. The idea that I could be washing up, hoovering, doing other tasks, or just walking down the road and still be entertained.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. And it does make a lot of sense. So tell us a little bit about story and why story matters so much.
So, yeah, for me, story matters so much because, like I said, it's a way to engage and retain a listener and keep their interest kind of on what you're doing. So, if you're just like blurting out a bunch of facts about something, numbers, stats, this, that report, it's not really going to kind of keep you interested. You're going to kind of, well, for most people, lose interest and fade away and go, oh, this is too much for me. But with a story, you can kind of pick up the pieces. Like if I was to mention Jack and Jill, you know what happened there. They went up the hill to fetch a pail of water, they came tumbling down, etc., etc. Stories have a way of packaging information that not only kind of engages us, but also is able to teach us at the same time and maintain our interest as well.
Mm, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So tell me a little bit, because one of the things that some of my clients will have concerns about is, well, it's just my story, or it's a story that happened to me. What would anybody care about that? That it's personal. I should really be focusing on giving them information and value, and especially first time trainers or speakers. they're really concerned about value, which doesn't, in their mind, equate to personal stories or stories that they tell. So, what would you say around that?
Well, value is important. Now, especially if you're a coach, it's important to be able to deliver value to your clients and whatever you're coaching them in. But there has to be a story there. If there's not a story there, they have nothing to kind of cling on to. And you can kind of make up a hypothetical story of you will be at point A, and then when you work with me, you'll be at point B. Now, you could go, you're going to start off making $10,000. When you work with me, you're going to make $50,000. That's useless. The way you kind of walk them through that story is first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into this and that. We're going to understand this and that. We're going to go, we're going to fix this, we're going to do that. And the idea of storytelling isn't so much so telling your own life story or telling someone else's life story. It's creating a journey with a beginning, middle, and an end. And that's as simple as it can be. So that beginning, middle, and end could all be financial, that, you know, you're going to begin at this number, we're going to work our way through to get to this end number. But it's really, really important to have that beginning, middle, and end. And kind of a way to cheat your way to this beginning, middle, and end when you're doing coaching is think about who you're speaking to, what you're going to give to them, and why. And you've been asking me the same question of, you know, why am I doing this? What have I done? Who am I? That is an element of storytelling. And if you can bring that to your brand, I don't know why it works. It just works. People connect with you on a different level. So if you know who you're going to speak to, if, like, example for you, you've got your maturepreneur thing, who are you speaking to? Mature entrepreneurs. What are you going to do to them?
Mhm.
Motivate them, make their business better, give them a way to see that, you know, their career doesn't have to end at 40 or 50. There's a long-term plan. And why do you care about this? It's something that you've done yourself. It's something that you have experience in and that you could talk about at length, and not only at length, but passionately. So just to kind of recap on that, it's the idea of having a beginning, a middle, and end in your sales process, in your marketing process, in your content plan, whatever it is, and knowing who you're speaking to, what you're speaking about, and why.
I love it. So tell me a little bit about how people can figure out their story arc or their story theme, or how to create that story, because beginning, middle, and end is great. And it, I often talk about the journey up the mountain. Where are they at when they're at the bottom of the mountain? What's the view from the top of the mountain? How are you getting them up the mountain? uh, but what is a way to access or approach storytelling that makes it more interesting? What are some tips for making story more interesting, appealing, sticky, or effective?
Mm. Well, a way that I suggest is called starting in the middle. So start at that rock bottom moment. You know, I was a single parent living on welfare. Bang, that's a hook right there. And things like, you know, big numbers and stuff like that. So, or the reverse of big numbers. You know, I was $20 million in debt. Whoa, that catches people. And then start the story from the beginning. But it's kind of like chopping the hook or the cliffhanger bit of the story to the middle or
Mhm,
to the beginning.
mhm.
That is the way to kind of get people to be interested in your story. Because if you start off with, I was born and I lived in Minnesota and then I did it, no one cares about that. But if you get to the point of, I was in Los Angeles, I had $5 in my pocket and I had no clue what was going on, people were like, wait, what was this person doing? And
Right.
doing that is a way to hook people into your story as well as into your branding, marketing, content, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it makes lots of sense. And I love that you tied in storytelling as a part of sales, because I think people think of it only from the perspective of marketing copy, or speaking, our keynote speeches, that kind of thing. But really, sales is nothing more than a story of where are you now? Where do you want to be? What would it be like to be there? And what are you willing to do to take that journey with me? And here's the journey. It's a story. It's a story of, hope, triumph, and aspiration. So what are some tools that help people be better storytellers? So say they're writing their story out. What are some tools that you would recommend, especially for people who are not necessarily good or native or experienced writers?
I would first suggest having like what I call a writing binge session where you write as much as possible. Doesn't matter about the order, just get it all out.
Mhm.
Have all those weird filler fluff bits and tangents and stuff like that, and then go through it maybe a day later or a day or two later and cut out everything that you found boring. Bearing in mind, you might go, oh, I find this all boring, it's all about me. that's fine, but try cut it down to the bare bones of what makes this interesting. How do I convey this story in as little words as possible? And then from there, you want to be able to connect to the dots between the two. And connecting the dots between the 2 or 3 points would be, okay, I've got this story of I'm over 50 now. I don't want to work for anybody else, but I don't know what to do. That's the beginning, middle, and end of your story, and the end would be where you're at now or where you're trying to get to. And you can go through, I was working in sales and this, that, the third. My boss was terrible and I really felt this way about him and he felt that way about me. But, realistically, I knew I shouldn't have been there. He tried to push me out of the workforce. And, now I'm unemployed. But I know that with my story, my purpose, and my mission, I can get somewhere with my now candle business or something like that. And
Yeah.
that's the reason why I put so much love, care, and attention into these candles. The smells will bring you peace and joy and all this kind of stuff. And, it will kind of flow once you've done that binge kind of writing, cutting it down and then trying to connect the dots. Because believe it or not, we're all naturally storytellers. And as long as you're able to kind of conversationally convey your story in a succinct way, writing it down is the same thing as just writing down what you would have said. And I highly suggest as well that you read it out loud, because if you read it out loud, you'll realize that you might have written things that you wouldn't normally say. We tend to have a way that when we're writing, we get all proper, go, oh yes, and this and that and the third and therefore and thus forth. If you speak like that, then great, but most people don't. And I would highly suggest that you write it down, connect those dots, and then read it aloud and go, okay, that word's a bit too airy fairy, that word's a bit too, you know, uh, out of my vocabulary. I wouldn't actually say that.
Right.
Change those words out for words you'd actually use, and that's a way to kind of craft your story. But the real tip here is to binge write it out and then cut it down.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. So, how does story relate to brand? So, because most people, when they think of brand, they think of logos and colors and fonts and so forth. But tell a brand story.
Yeah.
Would people use
Well,
that?
there's the very easy example of something like KFC. The brand story is in the logo. It's Colonel Sanders, and a lot of people won't know about Colonel Sanders, but he started that business. I think he was like 60 or 70. He was getting up there,
Yeah.
and he came across this chicken recipe, decided to make a restaurant around it, all that kind of stuff. But the story there is that there's this old trustable man who's decided to make fried chicken, and that gives it a kind of homely feel, even though it's not a homely kind of restaurant, if that make or fast food place. So
Mhm.
the story can be imprinted in your logo, or the story could be at the very core of what you do. So if you
Mhm.
look at a lot of charities, their story is at the core of what they do. If you look at things like Water Aid or Red Cross, they're like, these people over here are suffering. We're going to go over there and help these people, bring them water, food, aid, all that kind of stuff. And that story is a lot more of a kind of mission led or purpose led story. But in regards to bringing a story into your brand, it's the idea of what is the experience with your product or service. That's how you bring story into your brand.
So give me an example of what you mean by that. So I like the, Colonel Sanders example, and that his story is really um famous for how he was rejected so many times and he persevered, and it took like over 100 rejections or something like that before someone finally said yes to his recipe. And so there's that kind of story behind it as well as the visual. Let's talk, say, for a coach who's trying to figure out how to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. Where would be a starting point for them in thinking about story and how to use it to differentiate?
Yeah. So the thing I suggest is think of the things that are unique to you. So, for example, for me, if you're listening to this, you can't see me, but I'm a black man. I live in the UK. That's something that's unique to me. And that doesn't mean that's the only type of client I can go after, but it is something that I can kind of lean into as a coach. I can be like, hey, I know how tough it is to walk into a room and not feel confident about things. Or I know how tough it is to feel like you didn't get an opportunity simply because your last name is hard to say. Things like that can really kind of feed into your story because someone will relate to that. We all think our life experiences are incredibly unique, but honestly, at the core, we are all going through similar and same things. But if
Mhm.
you boil it down to the core of things, like, struggling with race, gender, or identity in general, that is something that everybody goes through. And even for the stereotypical white cis male, he goes through issues as well. It could be to do with confidence, it could be to do with how they look. all these things are relatable. But if you go with the things that are unique to you, as in the things that you can obviously see and the things that go on inside your head, I guarantee you that that is something that is relatable to other people, and there is a story there to be told that will
Mm.
not only attract your ideal clients but also keep them coming back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times when I'm working with clients, one of the things that we start with is what is the problem that you wished you had solved or that someone had solved for you when you started your coaching business or your business, because most of the time people start a business based on wanting to provide a solution that they wish they had had. And what was your story at that time? Because often that's the story of the people that you want to solve the problem for. Not always, but that's quite often the case, especially with coaches. So in terms of skills for telling stories, let's say as a speaker, what are some tools or tips that you would recommend, books, resources for people to get better at storytelling in their speaking?
So to get better with storytelling, again, it's the same thing of beginning, middle, and end. And the book I recommend is actually right behind me here. It's How to Tell a Story by The Moth. And
Oh,
The Moth is a podcast. I'll hold it up to the camera so everyone can see. It might be reversed, but yes, How to Tell a Story by The Moth. And The Moth is a podcast where people go up and tell this 10 to 15-minute story. And the whole podcast is geared around teaching you how to tell one specific story with a moral at the end. So if you were to listen to The Moth, the stories vary in what they're about. They could be about life struggles, they could be about something funny, they could be about someone's favorite ice cream. But the way that they craft these stories is second to none. And if I was to try and summarize that book and tell you about it, I'd be doing it a disservice. But I highly recommend that book. That
oh,
book has completely changed the way that I would tell a story, and I'm actually implementing it now into the kind of resources and materials that your listeners will be getting with this episode.
I love that. Actually, I've got it up here. I'm going to order it right away as soon as we finish here. It looks really interesting. And in terms of podcasting, let's talk about the importance of story on podcasting. Because again, as a podcast host myself, I've interviewed a lot of boring people and I've interviewed some interesting people. And a lot of times it's not necessarily the value of the content they're providing, it's how engaging and interesting they are. And often that relates to stories. What would you tell people in terms of how to be a better podcast guest around using stories? What's a way to weave it in there and find the balance between storytelling and getting a point or some value across?
Yeah, I would say when you're going to be a guest on a podcast, I've been a guest on a few podcasts, have a very clear title or idea of what you're going to speak about. The previous podcast I was on, I was talking about having done 100 episodes of a podcast and what I learned from speaking to 100 different entrepreneurs. And that could go any which way the host wanted it to go, but I knew that that was the confines of the conversation. And in this case, the confines of this conversation are about storytelling. So it's really on you to tell the host or help the host make their questions or kind of frame the conversation of, hey, I really want to talk about this thing. Here's an idea for a title. If you can build the episode around that or have your mind geared towards that, that really, really helps. But genuinely, to be a better guest, you have to get confident speaking. You got to learn how to cut out the ums and ahs, and that kind of stuff comes over time. We all have our filler words. Mine is or oh, yeah, but you'll learn how to speak with a natural rhythm and become a more confident speaker the more you do it. So it's one of those things that you have to practice, but genuinely try to answer your host question. If you can't answer it, be honest with them and hope that they edit their show and you can get that cut out. But take time if you need to have a pause to think and fully answer a question. And I highly suggest that people don't use notes where possible. And if you are going to use notes, just have little bullet points if you need a refresher, if there's certain points you want to touch on. But genuinely, it comes with practice, it comes with planning, and as well as that, it comes with kind of thinking, how can I deliver the most value? So in this case, I'm trying to give you as much value in this half an hour slot that I can about storytelling. But for me, storytelling's been, a wild 4 or 5 year journey where it's like I don't even think I'm really good at it yet. I'm just getting there and trying to get other people thinking in the same way. Because there's nothing worse than having an interview where it's like, here is question one, here is question two, here is question three. It really like kills the flow of a podcast or of a human interaction. If
Yes.
you ever have a conversation with someone, it goes up, down, left, right, all over the place. But if you're having a structured conversation in the form of a podcast, it's really on the host to kind of keep it going in the same way, and it's your job as a guest to give the best answer you can. And if it's a short answer, you just say up front, like, the short answer is da 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 da. And the host, if they're a good host, will go, well, tell me the long answer. We've got all this time in the world. Let's hear the long answer. But do your best to give a medium to long length answer where possible. And if you can't really think of much, or if you're really kind of got those nerves, just the short answer is, or to cut a long story short, it was this and that. But the last thing you want to do is give these really short, really sharp answers
Yeah.
that kill the flow of the conversation.
Exactly. Well, and using story, a good way to do that is to see if you can think of a story to illustrate the point. So a client case example or a success story or something like that. Speaking of stories and hosts, I was on a podcast earlier last week, Middle-Aged Mess. It was the most fun I've had on a podcast ever. I sometimes, when I'm asked, how did you get started as an entrepreneur, or tell me about your early life as an entrepreneur, or whatever, I have a story about when I was 5, because that really was my first entrepreneurial experience. I had a garage sale to earn enough money to buy a book that I wanted, and the lessons I learned from that. He would not leave the story. Like, the whole podcast is about dissecting that story and deeper diving into it and so forth. It was hilarious. And then a couple of other stories that went along with that about later stuff, but we didn't even get to the topic. So having what I call a signature story, a story that illustrates who you are, is a good idea. Do you work with clients to help them craft that kind of story? Again, what is this book that you recommended a good for resource for crafting that kind of, I call it a signature story or a genesis story, something that lets people know who you are, what you're about, and why you care. What do you call that, and how can people get better at creating that?
Yeah, no, that's a good title for actually a signature story. I've never actually tried to put a term on it, but with every client that I work with, I'm like, hey, what are we trying to give the listener here? What is the value that you're trying to provide to them, or why should they care?
Mhm.
And a current example is I've got a client who runs a massive property company. He was the founder and he hired a CEO to run the business. And most people think that the founder becomes the CEO. And we're really kind of trying to educate people on the idea of, just because you founded a company, you've done all the hard work, well done, you start this business, you might not be the best person to actually run, operate, and grow this company. Again, that niches us down because we're talking to people that have founded companies and are successful and are looking for a way to kind of get out of the day to day and, bring someone in to take care of that.
Yeah.
But getting that kind of dynamic down between the two hosts and, making sure that they're delivering value was hard. And I was like, okay, clearly you like to speak more than him, but realistically, you both need to speak as much as each other, if not talk to each other, rather than have 15 to 20-minute rants apiece. And
Right.
so really refining that down into a way of getting two people to tell their side of a story conversationally is hard to do, and it's something that you should do for yourself. So you should go to yourself, here's the story, here's what's going on. Okay, well, why did I do that? What did I do there that really helped me? And that is something that I would say that the Moth does really well, is that you don't come away from listening to a Moth podcast or one of those episodes with like questions. You come away with a complete vision of what that person was trying to tell you. So make sure that you kind of interrogate yourself or ask those follow-up questions like that guy did on the podcast you were on, where it's like they were so stuck on that one story that you didn't actually get to where you wanted to get to. But
Yeah.
now someone will come away with an understanding of you as a 5-year-old making all that money
Yes.
for a garage sale that
Yeah.
they would have never got anywhere else, because no one would really grab onto that story and really try squeeze it for all that's in
Yeah.
it.
Well, and I did weave in some entrepreneurial stories related to it and some points and so forth, but it was very funny because that's not normally where that goes. So it's like, okay, we're gonna go here now. Let's just be flexible, and away we go. But we had a lot of fun with it. So, is there any last mistakes that you see people making when they're trying to tell stories or use stories? For instance, one of the things, like, I wanted to write, people have told me all the time I should write a biography. I've had a very, very colorful, interesting life, and I cannot tell you how many people have said, you should write a book, you should write that. And for a long time, I was stopped by that because I thought, well, but it's all about me. What's the value for them? What's the benefit for them? It's all stories that didn't happen to them. So, what would you tell people in terms of that whole belief around, hey, it's a story that happened to me? How do they make it valuable for other people?
There's lessons in everything that you've been through. You know, we're all full of stories and learnings and lessons. The fact that you've made it to where you're at now, you have not lived this long without having some kind of lesson or learning. And it's all about distilling it down. Even if you've had the quote unquote perfect life,
Yeah.
how were you able to have this perfect life? What did you do that made you have this perfect life? If you had an unperfect life, what were the moments where you realized you messed up, or what were the moments you realized that you needed to make a change? And not everybody is always ready to have that kind of moment of realization or dive deep into like why they did what they did, or what's the impact of the things that they've done. But
Mhm.
genuinely, there's a story in everybody to be told, and it's just about kind of pulling it out yourself, especially if you're over like 30. You've got
Mhm.
30 years of life experience.
Yeah.
There's at least one good story in there. You've done something, I would hope.
Yes, yes. And if not, boy, you need to get a coach or something really quick because you need to get a coach, get a life. So yeah. Well, and as soon as someone said the words to me, instructional biography, it shifted my whole perspective because then it became a vehicle and a tool for making it about them because it can be instructional, it can be helpful. You can make a point with the stories, you can use it as a teaching lesson, like you said. So, Sam, how can people connect with you and find out more about you?
The best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. So my name is Sam, and then the last name is Mbatha, Sam Mbatha. You'll see me there. I'm in a white t-shirt, no hair, and I have a beard. That's the best way to get in touch with me. And if you add me, send me a message, be like, hey, heard you on the Prophet and Sisterhood podcast. Love to reach out. And as well as that, in the show notes, there will be a workbook to help you get your story down on paper and deliver more impactful, more story focused keynotes, speeches, workshops, seminars, whatever it is. But in the show notes, there'll be a link to that. So that's the way to get in touch with me.
Thank you. So we'll put the link in the show notes on also in the Facebook group if you're listening to this in the Purpose and Profit Sisterhood Facebook group. And if you don't find it, simply reach out to Sam on his website or on LinkedIn and check out what he can do for you in terms of Stringcast Media. And if you're thinking of a podcast, it'd be a good person to talk to about how to make it more interesting, how to make it more unique, how to make it something that's really truly engaging, and obviously thinking outside of the box. Because, like I said, I haven't. I just came from Podfest, and I didn't hear anyone who had an example of the kind of podcast you were talking about. It was almost all interviews or individual educational things, or even if some of them were very niched, like four different podcasts on produce. So I was like, seriously, really? And hundreds of thousands of listeners. So there's a podcast for everyone and a topic for everyone, and the way to be a much more interesting guest is to be willing, able, and efficient at or effective at telling stories so that it's more interesting for everyone. Thank you so much, Sam, for being here. Thanks for being an advocate for people to be really seen and heard in this way, to be more effective as speakers, to be more effective in terms of connecting with people, because stories really connect us. I mean, cavemen sat around fires telling stories. Uh, since human beings have been around, we love telling stories. So it's a the best piece of advice I ever got from someone was from a man named Reverend Park, and he was Korean. He said, "Cha, you must live a story life." Like, of advocating really living a life of interesting stories. And when we do that, then we get to the end of our life with a tremendous amount of lessons and value and interest, and it makes life all the richer. So
That's
live
so
a
true.
story life, everybody, and be willing to tell those stories as part of your branding, positioning, marketing, just being a cool, interesting human being. Thanks so much, Sam. What's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave everyone with?
Thank you so much for having me on. And the one last piece of advice I can give to people is I would say take time to think, take time to pause in life. Things can go a million miles a minute, but make sure you have a moment every day where you sit and reflect, whether that's just with a cup of coffee or while you're eating your breakfast or dinner. have a moment to sit and reflect on if you're doing it for the first time now, your whole life, and if you're doing it regularly, just the day or the last hour. That will
Mm,
really change you as a person.
beautiful. And also makes us pause and reflect on the story of what's just happened in our life. So it's a great way to gather those as well. Thank you for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, everybody who's listening, I hope that you live a story life. And I would love you to like or subscribe to the podcast. If you are a female entrepreneur who's looking for more support, please come and join the Purpose and Profit Sisterhood Facebook group. And do check out the show notes to grab Sam's great resource on how to construct your story so that you can get some help with that as well. Thanks for being here, everybody. Have a grand week. Bye for now.